Good morning, and sorry that we're starting a bit late. Of course, these ceremonies had to be carried out by Dr. Bangish. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be back at ThinkFest, and of course with Dr. Jalal, who is visiting from the US. Dr. Jalal needs no introduction. I'm sure all of you know her. Professor of History at the Tufts University. And this morning, we're going to be talking about her new book, The Muslim Enlightened Thought in South Asia. And we'll talk about her book and some of the key ideas that have been presented in that book as a means of engaging both with the past, with a view to the future, of course, as earlier was mentioned, how the link between past and the present exists. And it is a fascinating, riveting read. I was made to read it actually for this panel in the past 1 week, but I'm glad I did, and I'm glad Dr. Jalal, you're here. We'll start very, quickly with why this book, considering that you have a whole range of subjects that you've covered in South Asian history, and this particular focus on Muslim intellectuals, thinkers, poets of the late 19th century and early 20th century, and sort of excavating some of the thoughts and writings and ideas which have gone under shadows. What were you aiming to achieve?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I wrote the book so that I could answer the question, can Muslims be enlightened? Because clearly there's a very strong lobby that believes that they cannot. Because the scholarship tends to categorize Muslim thought into classical, traditional, modern, and also modern apologetics. So the categories, the tyranny of the categories prevents a real understanding of the content of the thought. And so I was interested in exploring the actual content and understanding the nature of it. The other reason I think I could add why I wrote the book is that there's been an overwhelming tendency to be reductive under the Orientalist influence combined with colonial rule, which has persisted into the post-colonial situation to reduce Islam to theology and jurisprudence. The example that I think is best shared with you is that of Jalaluddin Rumi, the most popular poet in the United States of America, who's seen to be a renegade Muslim, not really a Muslim, when his entire Masnavi is nothing but a interpretation of the Quran. So I think that's basically what led me to it. And I would just add that there's also a school of thought that believes that Muslims are inherently illiberal on account of their religion. So there was plenty of reason to write the book.
Right. Yeah.
Unless you're suggesting that I shouldn't have.
No, not at all. But I'm glad you did. And I'll start with you start the book with the idea of light and light upon light and how you look at its various manifestations in Muslim thought, both in the sort of older texts and more modern ideas. So you can expound a bit on that about what does it actually mean and how does, because enlightenment, as we know, is a Western idea, or we've made to believe that, but actually what you were saying in your book is quite the opposite, that there is a whole enlightenment tradition within the Muslim thought.
Well, yes, I think most people here too will believe that enlightenment came with the quote-unquote West, which I think is entirely ahistorical, incorrect. It's nothing but propaganda. So light is generally, and not just in Islam, is generally associated with life, with expansion, with an expansiveness, rather than insularity. And I do begin the book, the preface begins with a quote which is my favorite Quranic quote from the Surah Nur. So to basically make the point that the choice of, enlightenment, first of all, is not a Western gift, so-called, but it's sort of inherent in you, and it's your choice to either take a more expansive view of things or a rather more insular and closed-minded view of things. That's a choice that one has. So that's basically, and I completely reject the idea of enlightenment arriving to the global South. I think that different cultures had their own tradition. And light is something that is generally treated in much the same way in other religious traditions as well, and not just Islam.
Yes, and I think that idea takes us to how you, sort of engage with the term Roshan Khayali and trace it through the various writings and poetics of many Muslim thinkers, especially in the late 19th century. And so is Roshan Khayali the equivalent of what we understand from the Western liberal canon?
Well, Muslims are excluded from the liberal canon.
Yes.
And I think we have to accept that. And so to all those liberals with great sort of apologies, you are not considered liberal. You have to be a liberal. Enlightenment is, as I said, it's an attitude of mind. It's something that your own religion that you talk about so fervently urges you to seek knowledge, even if it means going as far as China, is a paraphrased statement that we hear all the time. So, the entire thrust of the Quran, as I read it, is on knowledge, ilm. And so I think it's really important for us to understand, those who believe that enlightenment came with the West, and so we are just catching up with the West for the rest of our lives constantly, ignore a large chunk of history. You've airbrushed Muslim contributions, and I think that is really important to acknowledge, that this process has been going on forever. And you can't, if the Muslims built on Greek thought, which was then sort of, they translated into Arabic, and then that sort of enabled the European Enlightenment, is something to be acknowledged. But I'm of course not going all the way back, but I'm looking at the late 19th and early 20th century period, where I found, surprisingly, that these individuals that I do study were actually engaged with the periods of enlightenment in earlier Islamic history.
Correct. They do, and we'll talk about that, how they also set out to build a historiography of Muslims, which is a very important part of your book. But before we do that, I also want to ask you, and for our audience, is how in the post-Mughal era, post-1857 milieu in India, how were these Muslim writers, and you look at so many of them, of course, how they were negotiating with new ideas, with the Western ideas, or the colonial forms of knowledge and things, because there was an interaction going on, there was an engagement going on. In particular, later on, you talk about Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Mirza Ghalib, etc. So, tell us about how did they negotiate with modernity, if I may.
Again, there's a dominant school of thought that believes that Muslims are insular, and that because of their religion cannot be quote-unquote liberal, whatever that means, because liberalism itself is a very problematic concept, even in the so-called West. So these individuals, then there's the idea of apologetic modernity. Now, apologetics is a concept that came from Protestant Christianity, which was to provide reasoned thought. But the apologetic modernity, when it comes to the Muslims, really reduces apologetics to apology, which, as you all know, means sorry. So it's a sorry modernity. So I really wanted to disentangle that in my work, and also to challenge those scholars who mistakenly argue that Muslims were non-dialogical. They were non-dialogical, insular, and so on the contrary, when you read the late 19th and early 20th century literature, especially in Urdu, which is what the book is based on, they were actively engaged with ideas that were coming. And I think that, one of the most important things about Sayyid Ahmad Khan is that he's telling his readers, he's telling his co-religionists that, your bigotry towards the new kinds of knowledge is totally misconceived, because, we gave our enlightened thought to Europe, and now they are giving it back to us, so don't be close-minded. But when you actually look at serious writers of this period, they were actually very familiar with Western ideas, and they were incorporating it. The sad part is that this construct of the West versus the East, pure construct, I always wonder whether Christianity is a Western religion or is it an Eastern religion. But I think this is just an ideological propaganda where you say that there's a West and there's an East, and they are and the twain shall never meet. Whereas the actual evidence suggests that there was an active exchange. And what is more, that there is no such thing. I mean, yet that people who engaged with it thought they were contributing to human knowledge. And human knowledge is cumulative. It is not racially determined.
Yeah. And I think that's another theme in your book. I mean, I wanted to come to it later, but knowledge for the sake of acquiring knowledge. I mean, you know, it's not Eastern, it's not Western. So expound a little more on that, because I think that's a very important theme of this book and something that I suppose has to be reiterated in today's world, I mean, especially in South Asia.
I mean, again, let me return to say that much of the scholarship, even now, that is coming out is overwhelmingly on Muslim theology, Muslim jurisprudential thought. There's very little, I mean, or when you do, I mean, I don't deny that people are doing literature, but that's not really considered to be contributions to Muslim thought. That just seemed to be a sideline. So I do think that I'm questioning the Orientalist paradigm that reduces Islam to theology and religion. And so I look at literature, I look at works on ethics, on akhlaq, and to show that they were not only drawing upon the Muslim tradition, the historically evolving Muslim tradition, but they were also engaging, when appropriate, with thought that you could say, quote unquote, is from the West. I mean, I don't accept the category, but that's basically what I would say, quote unquote, the West.
So in the earlier part of the book, Mirza Ghalib, the great poet, of course, emerges as this icon or enigmatic of Roshan Khayali, of his open-mindedness, his ideas, his and you go at great length. I mean, that's a very interesting reading of Ghalib per se, because so maybe speak a bit about that.
I mean, let me also sort of say that one of the reasons I also wrote the book is it's a culmination of a long journey, which I began with my book Self and Sovereignty, which came out in 2000, where I distinguished between religion as identity and religion as faith. That book pretty much sort of looked at religion as identity. And in my explorations into what faith meant to Muslims, I then ended up doing a second book called Partisans of Allah, because I realized that jihad, contrary to what is made of it, was really an ethical struggle. But even there, I was dissatisfied with my ability to understand iman, or faith, of a Muslim. And then I realized that the problem really lay in the fact that the moment you go into a collective concept of faith, you end up with identity rather than actual, I mean, personal faith is personalized. So in this book, I've looked at people, I mean, the main purpose of the first part of the book is the transcreation of religion after 1857, how the colonial state altered the very meaning of religion. From being a matter of personal faith or piety or devotion to the Creator to an identity factor, where you distinguished yourself from others. So that, I think, and Ghalib was an ideal person to start with, not least because I think, I mean, for me, he is the most sort of a fantastic poet ever. And Ghalib was always on this rather, I mean, he was, he was on the sort of borderline of faith and infidelity. And, he constantly tries to say that he is a Muslim. But because of his temperament, because of his personality, many people regarded him as a renegade.
Yes.
So beginning with Ghalib, because Ghalib also was a witness to 1857, it was particularly interesting for me to explore how post-1857, how Delhi itself went through spatial alterations. So how space, I mean, even the space of the Jamia Masjid alters.
Yes.
And what the formal end of the Mughal Empire meant for religion. So what I'm really trying to argue through Ghalib is that religion as a census category, where you add up the numbers of Muslims, tells you nothing about anybody's faith. And so that's basically what the dialectic is. It's religion as faith and religion as a census category.
Yes, exactly.
There's a distinction between that.
Correct. And much of present days, India and Pakistan are sort of still...
It's not just India and Pakistan. I think Pakistanis generally are more concerned about identity than the quality of their faith. They talk about it all the time, but they know nothing about it.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'll. That was a great remark. Anyway, so one of Ghalib's contemporaries, or even his students, was Sayyid Ahmad Khan. We already briefly mentioned him. I mean, who's this major figure for so many decades? You know, founding the Aligarh movement, and also in terms of all that he wrote. His engagement with science, with reason, his way to level both reason and revelation. And there's a lot of references there in your book as well. So how important is Sayyid Ahmad Khan in this journey in terms of locating and presenting and writing the enlightened thought of that particular time within the Urdu writings and other, discourses that he presented for the public?
I mean, the trouble with historical treatment of Sayyid Ahmad has been that he's primarily seen either as the father of the quote-unquote two-nation theory or as someone who was a collaborator. And those, again, I mean, this kind of characterization, putting people into pigeonholes, I mean, in my view, it's because people can't really read the actual material that he's producing. Now, he was a man who orchestrated an entire movement that everybody knows as the Aligarh movement. And that movement was engaged with new ideas that they were embracing when they were appropriate for them. But never losing their moorings in the Islamic tradition, in the Muslim tradition. And in that context, I think in the second part of the book, I explore how the displaced Muslim self dealt with history. Because one of the main incentives to engage in history under Sayyid Ahmad's instructions was to sort of challenge the colonial representations of Muslim history. Most of the colonial history is basically by colonial officials turned historians. And so there was a very strong colonial project that wanted to argue that Muslims were necessarily illiberal, they were sort of oppressive rulers. And so I think that under Sayyid Ahmad's influence, people like Maulana Shibli Nomani undertook a project on the heroes of Islam, but the one that I particularly spent time with is Al-Mamun. Now, Al-Mamun, of course, is the Abbasid caliph, and it's a very interesting book because it's showing how the struggle between history and revelation was dealt with. I won't go into the details because it's going to become long-winded, but basically what Shibli proves is that there is no necessary contradiction between Islamic thought or Islamic teachings and history. So revelation can be accommodated within the historical profession, because there are people who think that revelation is eternal, cannot be questioned. But I think that it's important to understand what revelation has meant to Muslims over history. I mean, the whole problem with the treatment of Muslim thought is that there are schools of thought that turn Islamic ideas into eternal ideas rather than how they have changed. I mean, this is something I even did at Partisans of Allah, that the idea of jihad itself undergoes change. It's not that there is a theory and practice dichotomy, but the very idea changes over history. So that's what I think I tried to do. That history and reason were deemed to be compatible by this lot, known as the, for lack of I think a shortcut would be Aligarh movement, and then also that it was compatible with history and revelation. That was my interest.
Right, exactly, and with Sayyid Ahmad Khan's sort of these ideas and the influences of colonial. The other two characters that are really intriguing in the succeeding chapters are Deputy Nazir Ahmed, who's otherwise known to us as this prolific writer in Urdu, or also happened to be a civil servant in the Raj, and then there's Zakaullah. You talk about their friendships and their engagement with the British, not just in terms of ideas, but also as persons, as friends, and that particular phase is something that I think is one of the unique parts of that book, especially the reading of Nazir Ahmed's works, because at the prima facie they're like simple stories every day of the simple lives in Delhi, but in effect he's also presenting a whole narrative on Muslim modernity.
That's right. Well, I mean, I think the important thing about Zakaullah and Nazir Ahmed is that they were not just friends, they were very good friends with a very famous Christian missionary known as C.F. Andrews. And if you read C.F. Andrews' work, you will see what he thinks of Zakaullah as a man that he considers not just enlightened, but extremely even-handed with religious community on matters of religion. So I do think that, again, in terms of my pursuit of what faith means to Muslims, Zakaullah was a particularly good example. Zakaullah has written histories. I mean, he was not a trained historian, nor was Shibli, but he wrote a very comprehensive history of India, of Hindustan. He also wrote a lot of books on ikhlaq, ethics. When it came to, I mean, Zakaullah was never very successful with his work, even though he was a prolific writer. He was, he borrowed work from English writers and turned them into Urdu to introduce them to the Urdu reading public. Nazir Ahmed, on the other hand, after he finished his work in the civil service of the British, took to writing novels, and I look at Ibn al-Waqt, which I think is a very interesting insight into modernity, of how they were wrestling with modernity. And that clearly was a very popular book, whereas books he wrote on ethics didn't do as well. Yes. So it's interesting to see how those questions about history and reason, whether reason is compatible with Islam, are dealt with in Nazir Ahmed's didactic works. He's a didactic writer. Yes. He's educating, yes. But that was the moment in history. So I think it's very
by characters.
So that's what they're doing, and there's also a very strong critique of English educated Muslims who can speak English but know nothing at all about their own religion and tradition. Yeah. And of course, what I would add is the biggest sort of problem with the onset of colonialism was the loss of Persian. Yes. And without Persian, you can't really master Urdu. So that was a constant critique of Zakaullah's and Nazir Ahmed's with Sir Syed, that they really ought to not discontinue Persian. Yeah. That they even believed, I mean, and I think one of the most interesting parts of this relationship is what was going on in Delhi College. Before the rebellion of 1857, when works were being translated by strongly in favor of continuing in Urdu as the medium. But the switch to English came out of pragmatism, and I think was ultimately a mistake.
Okay. Well, okay. And in one of the characters, and you quoted there how in Nazir Ahmed's work, they talk about Muslims should be ijtihadis as opposed to being jihadis.
Well, ijtihad is a form of jihad, so long as you believe that jihad is not. I mean, if you want to take the Orientalist interpretation, then yes, jihad is military struggle to dominate others. Whereas, as I've shown in Partisans of Allah, jihad really means to strive in the way of Allah. So ijtihad is a form of jihad, but I think what Nazir Ahmed was trying to argue was that ijtihad, which means independent reasoning, should be the primary focus and not the idea of struggling against colonial rule, because first of all, jihad can't be waged unless success is assured. So I think that's what he was trying to do in his work, especially the one that I use, Ruhe Sadiqa.
Yeah, that certainly is a very fascinating reading of Dipti Saab's works. But two other characters that emerged later and which you spent some time looking at is Sayyid Amir Ali and Azad's sort of entire documentation of Akbar's Darbar and style of governance.
Muhammad Hussain Azad, not Maulana Azad.
Muhammad Hussain Azad. So these two...
I think what was interesting for me with Muhammad Hussain Azad's Darbar-e Akbari is that it is roundly critiqued by colonial officials as well as a handful of Muslim and Indian writers, that it is not really a history. Now the question is what constitutes history, and what we believe is history is very much a colonial construct. But it's still very interesting that Darbar-e-Akbari, which is a most delightful read, is still in print and is constantly read. But it was never considered a serious history. But the way he writes, and why does he write about Akbar as an enlightened ruler, was also his way of challenging the colonial paradigm, which says that no ruler who is Muslim could conceivably be enlightened. Muslims can't be enlightened.
That was a thesis, yeah. But at the same time, what you also interrogate in the late 19th century writings and early 20th century is also the gendered exclusion of women figures in historiography, in other popular narratives, and there's a tension.
Well, yes, again, I will say that the exclusion of women is not restricted to Islam. That liberalism, or so-called Western liberalism, also hasn't particularly been doesn't have a very strong forte when it comes to women. So yes, I mean, the enlightened Muslim thinkers were agreed when it came to the women's question that they should be excluded. So you have, I look at ways in which someone like Abul Harim Sharar deals with the personality of Mumtaz Mahal. For whom we've always believed, that she, in producing so many children for Shah Jahan, couldn't possibly be a very, independent-minded woman. But he presents her through fiction as a very strong personality who has ideas of her own. And so, but the question that really comes out of this is to look at a character like Zeb-un-Nisa. Zeb-un-Nisa, of course, is Aurangzeb's daughter, who I think a lot of Lahoris think she's buried here when she's not. That's just a myth. But in terms of her representation, I was amazed at the sort of literature that came out in the late 19th and early 20th century on Zeb-un-Nisa, who was a personality, who was a poetess, who was very enlightened, very close to Dara Shikoh and her aunt Jahan Ara. And so she wrote a corpus which even someone like Shibli and then backed by Jadunath Sarkar says are not her own. It's not her own poetry. So not only do you write women out of history, you deny them authorship.
Right.
And this is the problem. It's actually just exclusion, which I think is what I was trying to draw.
Yeah,
so this is the blind spot of enlightened thought amongst men.
Right.
Whether they are Christian, whether they're Hindu, whether they're Buddhist, or whether they are Muslim. It's a male problem.
Constant, yeah. But anyway, the sort of writing and the focus on Zeb-un-Nisa was really interesting, and because it is Lahore and she did spend time here, so I thought we should mention this aspect. But anyway, when you move on to the 20th century, the early 20th century, and then of course you're looking at emergence of other important enlightened thinkers and poets, especially Iqbal. Now Iqbal, who's our national poet in Pakistan, whose work and ideas have been appropriated totally by the state for its own purposes. And the Iqbal that we read, the Iqbal who's writing letters to Atiya Faizi and their correspondence and his the evolution of his ideas and his engagement with the colonial era. I think that is something that the audience would really benefit from.
Well, again, I've been long interested in developing, analyzing Iqbal's concept of time. And since I was interested in history and his historiography, I was particularly interested in his concept of time. I can't claim to have written about the entire corpus of Iqbal. Iqbal, I think, is a lifetime study, and even one lifetime is not enough to assess this man, who I think in 400 years is probably the best Muslim thinker. So I was particularly interested in his treatment of time. He distinguishes between mechanical serial time and pure duration. So I think his concept of time as pure duration allows us to understand that it is not that the past has happened in the past, but it is very much there in the present. And because the colonial sort of imposition was that, it's a linear history. So the best in Muslim and in fact even Hindu civilization or traditions had passed. And now you were moving towards in a linear way. Whereas Iqbal shows you that there is no such thing as linearity. It's pure duration. And he ends up with the idea of constant creation. There is no such thing as a static world. And here I was able, and of course one of the themes that runs through the book is between human freedom and predetermination. So Iqbal is an opponent of those who believe that all that was best in Islam has already happened. He's trying to tell you that you've got to constantly create anew, because the world is constantly being created anew, which I think is a very enlightened, expansive way of thinking.
Yes.
So that was my primary interest in Iqbal. Like I haven't tried to write about just one chapter on Iqbal.
No, but I mean this idea which fits into the Roshad Khayali or the opening of minds. But sadly, Iqbal that we read and we understand is not the same figure.
First of all, you cherry pick Iqbal. As any poet, Iqbal is open to misinterpretation. As a poet, I mean, with poets, they say things which you can misinterpret or interpret in a way that is not intended. So I always believe that Iqbal should be understood in the context of his entire corpus, which is not always easy. I took time, his concept of time, because I'm exploring what has been done with concepts of history and also with the notion of the role of human free will versus predetermination. So I think that what has happened with Iqbal, certainly in the post-colonial period, is his complete appropriation by the state. And I quote Safdar Mir, who goes so far as to argue that the right wing, as he calls it, have planted Maududi's ideas and claimed that these are Iqbal's ideas. Yes. So I do think that that's a very interesting, so there is a need to retrieve Iqbalian thought, because what has happened under state sponsorship is that Iqbal has been reduced to glorifying Islam and forgetting his message of struggle and constant creation.
Change, basically.
He says, I have a time with God. You have to sort of be a part of the constant process of recreating the universe.
Correct.
Which again is an expansive way of moving forward. Yes.
And the other intriguing, of course, a very fascinating character is the artist Sadequain, who emerges in the book as this, an artist who's sort of also a thinker, a poet, is half the time in the West, engaging with the Parisian artists and academy, and then being in Pakistan back home and doing all these murals and sort of working on Iqbal's ideas.
That's the reason
referring a lot to his thought. So
there are people who've written books on Sadequain. Again, I was primarily interested in seeing how Sadequain used Iqbalian thought in his public murals. So I was particularly interested. I mean, my book has his mural, which is actually the Lahore.
At the Punjab Public Library, I think that's
the book out.
Yeah.
Yes, the mural is this is his. So I mean, but Sadequain again. I mean, he was a poet. He was enlightened. He was a controversial figure. We all know that. But my interest in Sadequain was to show how, even in the post-independence period, the idea of Roshan Khayali persisted. And even in the darkest of times, there were always been thinkers in this country and in the subcontinent who have been Roshan Khayal.
Yes, and that's what his artworks, and you go at great lengths to sort of link it to Iqbalian thought as well. But I think there are two other figures which are very important in the context of after the 1947, once a new homeland for Muslims, came into being, are Fazlur Rahman, the scholar, and then Pervez, who also was engaging with some of these ideas and trying to inculcate these Roshan Khayal notions into the larger Muslim thought. But both of them faced a lot of, opposition.
Well, I think what I'm trying to argue there, again, these are very short write-ups on Fazlur Rahman and also Pervez. But my point really is that the presumption that there is something inherently wrong with Islam, as is the Orientalist and also the contemporary view of Islam, that there's something wrong with the religion, that it's nothing to do with the religion having gone through so much of the earlier period, is that it was authoritarianism. It was military authoritarianism. Even Fazlur Rahman's association with the Ayyub regime really creates the problem, as it does with Pervez. Had they not been statist, I think their ideas on Islam may well have had greater reception in this country, but they didn't manage because they were associated with the state.
Right, they were, and you narrate that whole era of the 1960s. But Dr. Ayesha, what has happened alongside these amazing figures and this engagement with the ideas is that we also see the ascendancy and rise of I would say, whatever is anti-Roshan Khayal, Tariq Khayal maybe, Tariq Khayali, that we see more of evidence in the post-1947 Pakistan, and in India, once again, the colonial construct of Muslims being insular and fossilized and not thinking is now the dominant idea. If you look at what is said about Muslims in India by their mainstream leaders or even some so-called liberal writers and thinkers, it's appalling. And of course, we kind of feed that because those are the kind of ideas we also in Pakistan project, especially by the state.
Well, exactly, because you don't really do research. But if you were to do research and read your own materials, you'd think otherwise. But these are inherited sort of views of what Islam is. But it is true that in the post-independence period, the onset of military authoritarianism, which, as I've written several books on authoritarianism, it started, as I pointed out, as early as 1951 with the Rawalpindi conspiracy case, when Faiz Ahmed Faiz was incarcerated. Yes. And so the curbs on thought, on independent thought, has been a feature of the post-independence period. But I think what is still remarkable is that despite that, people have still written works that are enlightened and continue to do so to this day.
Yeah, that tradition continues.
So even as I conclude the book by saying that there, in this period of darkness, there are 1,000 candles to light up the night.
Yes, of course, Ghamidi Saab being one example, and there are many others.
And all of them have been hounded out of the country.
Yeah, that's the only, the caveat. I think I'll conclude with one final thought, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, because I'm sure many of the members of the audience have many questions to ask. Dr. Jalal, once I finished your book, and I was thinking this morning that a lot of what you've done in this book actually merits also the rethinking of Pakistan's education system. Of course, we've been saying that and writing that, but looking at some of these traditions within our immediate past, it's not even ancient past, it's like, 30, 40, 100 years at best. What can be, and you've taught here as well, you were teaching at LUMS for many semesters. What can be done there to introduce these ideas? Because the kind of history that we teach, or even Islamic studies that we teach, barely or rarely touch upon these themes. Roshan Khayali is considered still as a kind of a gali, as a curse word. Liberal to bilkul hi out hai, wo to fascist hai, scum hai, or whatever. But even Roshan Khayali is seen as somebody kind of challenging the orthodoxy or the tradition, or so what do we do?
It's just that you have to accept that a large number of your co-religionists in this country and perhaps beyond have so much, and they've imbibed the colonial logic to such an extent that they can't get out of it. So they feel that this is what it is. But effectively, the Islam that you see discussed is the colonial construct, the Orientalist construct of Islam, which is reductive. And consequently, and when you say educational institutions, I mean, more has been written on education in this country than you can imagine. More commissions have been created on education. None of them get implemented. Why? Because it's a political issue. So what do they fear is the primary question. And I do think that this work, one of the charges against the so-called liberals is that they're if you take secularism, I begin the book with secularism, what the term means, or the idea means. And if you look at a dictionary, Urdu dictionary, secularism is translated as la diniyat, which is inaccurate completely. So I do think that my book, which by sort of moving away, is a critique of Western, quote-unquote, Western liberalism, because nobody really can tell me what this liberalism is, because if anything, it's hypocritical. It's exclusionary, it's hypocritical structurally, it excludes more than includes. And so the point is that if you move away from liberalism to Roshan Khayali, which is a concept, it's very important that Muslims who are writing in this period don't use, there's so many English words that have found a home in Urdu, but not liberalism.
Yeah.
And I think I'd only sort of expand that by saying that not even Muslims, but non-Muslims in India did not want to be called liberals, because liberalism was associated with empire, and empire's hypocrisy, empire's sexual exclusions and oppressions. So the term that was used was Roshan Khayali, Damaghi Wusat, Azad Khayali. These were terms already in existence in the Persianate ecumen. So that's what is going on. So this is also a sort of a critique of those Western writers, or quote-unquote, or those influenced by the quote-unquote Western writers, that Enlightenment came from the West, that these people were incapable of enlightenment. They had to be, so the light came from the West. So these people who were writing about Roshan Khayali chose to write about Roshan Khayali as they understood it from their own tradition.
Right, thank you. Decolonization project, I suppose, is both relevant for Pakistan and India as well.
Very much so. India more so now than ever, because Hindutva is effectively a colonial. It's a colonial concept. It's a derivative of colonial thought on Muslims. Insofar as if you look at, Hinduism is much more accommodative than the Hindutva philosophy is. That is so deeply, Savarkar, Golwalkar, they're all influenced by colonial writers.
But thank you so much. Please give her a big hand and get the book. Thank you. Thank you.